Yeah, I guess the recorder is on.
All right. So,
Yep.
uh, welcome to the Sunday call, folks, and I'm glad to see you. Um, Agnes is having trouble with her microphone, so she'll be calling back in. So, both Marcus and Amit were wanting to speak more about jhana. And I assume what that means is that you want to talk about the higher jhanas in relationship to perception. Because we can start off with the basics of the first jhana, which seems easy enough to do, except that you have to keep practicing to get it good. That everything about the jhanas is dependent upon the skill that you develop for the first jhana. Because if you can't control the first jhana, you've got no chance of being able to control the higher jhanas. However, we can touch them, visit them shortly. The mind will go in and go out of various states, basically without our control or obvious control. In other words, give an example of a sunset. That if it catches your attention and you are looking at the um, the sunset, generally people will go into an awe state, wow kind of state, and that state then would be the first jhana, and often it has no words to it, and we feel really good watching that. All kinds of things besides the sunset would happen. Um, a noise can happen, and we don't know what it is, and so we start listening carefully to that noise or that sound, and by listening, we have come into a state of thoughtless because we're taking sensory input. That's what the mind is focusing on is sensory input. We can also see a mountain vista or a valley, something like this, and that when we see those things, it will cause a wow experience. I assume that everybody knows what I'm talking about because you've had those things probably 400 or 500 times in your lifetime, if not more. Drew, do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
Looking at something and becoming absorbed with it.
uh, I mean, actually, yeah. Usually, like when
Yeah.
you're watching TV, like you just forget that the TV is in the room.
No, I'm not talking about that.
No?
No, I'm talking about looking off a cliff, looking off of a precipice, looking at a sunset,
I
looking at
once
a
was looking at
mountain
a cup of
vista.
tea and then I got absorbed into that. That was a long time ago. Happened only
Okay,
once, but it did change my perspective quite a bit.
all right. Amit, how about you? Do you know
Yeah,
what I'm talking?
yes, definitely, definitely. So today morning I saw the sunrise, and I have this small off feeling about it. Especially now
Yeah.
in winter, it's also very comforting to see the sun coming.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Marcus? Have you had such an experience that you remember? You've had these experiences, you might have forgotten about them.
Yeah, I was just thinking that I can't name one offhand, but I'm sure it's happened without me really being conscious of what that experience
Mm-hmm.
was like in particular.
It can actually happen when we stub our toe or if we fall down. We'll go into a state of not knowing that, in fact, it's often called a state of shock. That when we are injured, we go into a thoughtless state, that, in fact, the injury will sustain pain later. But in the initial reaction, there's no pain. because we're in a state of shock. Does that ring a bell for you, um, Drew?
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So these are states of mind that we go into, and we've done it dozens, if not hundreds, of times in our lifetime. That in fact, people go on vacations to beautiful tropical islands or the mountains or whatever just so that they can have that experience, and they wind up many times not having that experience. It can also happen when you're watching a sports event, for instance, when you're actually watching someone run and you're watching what they're doing and you're not thinking about it much. Have you ever had that kind of experience, guys? How about you, Marcus? Of being able to watch something and not try to figure it out, just having that sensory input. A mountain, a stream, something interesting. By the way, children do this quite a lot. It's called play.
Hmm.
When we go into a state where we're just completely within sensory input. This is an important point. If you can understand what we're talking about, then you can understand that the jhanas are all about intentionally going into that state and maintaining it, as opposed to going in and out of it because we got absorbed with something. It can happen with a cup of tea. It can happen with the taste of Coca Cola. It can happen in many places. It can happen when we see an automobile accident. It's often called rubbernecking. Have you ever heard of the term rubbernecking? You know what that means?
Oh yeah, yeah,
You see that automobile accident, you see that crash, and as you're driving by, you're not paying any attention to anything other than what we're seeing. In fact, it can happen on television, not when there's dialogue, but say the scene of a car chase or something like this, to where we really get absorbed in what we're watching and to not thinking about it, not having even any intention about, oh, I hope everything is going to be all right, or will he make this next curve, or any of that kind of thought. We're just really absorbed in it. Now, here's an example of when someone, for instance, in a sunset, 5 or 6 people are watching that sunset intensely, and one woman gets her cell phone out and takes a picture of it. That's when she's doing that, she's not in this flow state. Okay, you've heard of this issue of flow state. It can happen with people who are in sports. It can happen with musicians. It can
it happened to
happen.
me once in a cricket match.
Pardon?
It happened to me once in a cricket match. I was standing behind the batsman. I was very young, and it was just totally by accident. But the ball came towards me, and it came towards me fast,
Mm-hmm.
like very fast. But I was just there, relaxed, paying attention, and suddenly the ball just slowed down. I could see it spinning slowly, and I realized, oh, it's going to my right. It's quite low, and just all of that happened, and I caught the ball, and then I was like, oh, I'm off balance. I need to make sure that I don't drop the ball on the ground. And this, I remember it so clearly. And then,
Except that that was probably not a verbal thought that you had. It was a different kind of thought because it was much faster. If you had
oh
talked
yeah.
yourself into catching your balance, you'd have already fallen over.
Oh no, I didn't need to follow. I didn't need to catch my balance. I just needed to fall over in the right way. So I just lifted the ball up and then fell on my back.
Mm-hmm.
And then everyone else, and I remember it being quick per se, but that was not my experience of it. Everyone else was like, that was a lightning fast catch. How did you do that?
Mm-hmm.
And I was like,
Uh,
it wasn't fast for me. I saw the ball spinning nice and slow.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, because you're in a flow state.
Oh,
People who are in boxing matches or martial arts, they can get into that flow state, which means that everything slows down and you can see what your opponent is doing as he's doing it. There was also a time when I had a big motorcycle accident. Some dude came rolling out. He was drunk. He was on his moped or bicycle or whatever. Lady bike, they call them in Thailand. And he hit me right in the leg. He came sideways. From the moment that I could see that he was going to hit me and I had no choice about it, from then on, I was in that kind of a flow state. I remember as the motorcycle continued on and that I was riding it, but I had no control over it because it had been crashed into. And as I started to roll through the air, I knew that. I could see all of that stuff happening. Happened within a couple of seconds, but it would take me 30 minutes to describe to you all that I remember that happened during those a few seconds. This is what we're talking about again, that flow state, where things truly do kind of slow down, but another way of talking about it is the mind gets really sharp. Because things don't slow down, you speed up. And the reason that we're speeding up, it's not really speeding up, is that we're just taking input and taking input, and we're not thinking about it, we're not processing it, we're not having any perceptions, we're just merely receiving the input. If we can understand this quality, now we can start to talk about the jhana states. Now, the first jhana is not quite into this flow state yet. It's on its way. And that the whole quality, and I want to emphasize this over and over again, is that in order to be able to control this flow state, rather than it happening by accident, one must be able to control the first jhana very well. That most of the people that I know, everyone that I know, in fact, will be practicing. They'll go into the first jhana, and then they want to and have, let us say, some skills built to go into the second jhana, but they don't stay. They'll come back out, and often what they come back into is the hindrances. And so, what we must practice, in fact, this is an important point. It's so important that in Sutta number 36 in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Buddha actually says that this flow state of the first jhana is the enlightenment. It is the path to enlightenment. It is the path that will take you into that state over and over again so that we can begin to control it. Now, the analogy that the Buddha gives in Sutta number 19, you probably heard me talk about this sutta, is about the analogy is about a cow herd that has about a half a dozen or more cows that he's taken to pasture. And along the way to the pasture, he has to pass through a built up area where people are on the path, are selling goods, selling carrots, selling oranges, or selling whatever, avocados, nuts, whatever, or they are doing their laundry and the kids are running around. And that cow herd has to get through that area with his cows without causing any damage. The analogy is can you get through the next 3 to 5 minutes without having any harmful, unwholesome thoughts? And what the cowherd has to do is to be diligent to watch those cows so that if one of the cows tries to grab a carrot off of the stand, he's going to whack that cow. He's going to whack him with that stick that he carries. And he's going to keep those cows in line until he gets past that place and out to the pasture. And then the cows are going to put their heads down and start to graze on whatever stubble that's left. Mostly it's rice stubble that they have. Um, and that while they're grazing, the cow herd doesn't have to stand there with the cows whacking them anymore. And so we could say that then that whacking quality is our practice of anapanasati, of whacking those unwholesome thoughts and getting them back in line. So that if we have any fear, any thoughts of fear, any jobs to do, and any thoughts about jobs to do, we can whack those thoughts and say, right now, there's nothing to do. Right now, I feel safe. Right now, I feel comfortable. Right now, I am satisfied. And so that's the way that we get those cows, the thoughts of the mind, out to the pasture. So that when they're in the pasture, they are now one wholesome thought after another wholesome thought after another wholesome thought. And then we can go sit down. Like the cowherd would go sit under a tree, but he's going to keep his eye on those cows. He's not going to go to sleep because they'll wander off. So he's going to watch them. But he doesn't have to be standing there whacking them. So this is then the state of the first jhana, is that when we have all of our ducks or all of our cows all lined up so that they are one wholesome thought after another wholesome thought after another wholesome thought. And we need to practice this. We need to practice it in the morning. We need to practice it in the evening. We need to practice it when we're going to the toilet. We need to practice it when we're eating food. We need to practice it when somebody slaps us. We need to practice when somebody insults us. We need to practice when they're yelling at us. Any time of the day that's going to bring us into a state of unwholesome thoughts. We need to come out of those unwholesome thoughts back into wholesome thoughts. In other words, we're learning to control the mind. There's no way we're going to stop it if we can't steer it. Does everybody understand this? You're
Yeah.
not going to get able to actually stop the mind until you can control the mind to keep it into wholesome. So that we have one wholesome thought after another after another. This is about 90% of all of the practice that you'll need to do. And the goal is to get the mind into a wholesome state and keep it there. And if you can get the mind in a wholesome state and keep it there while you are in that state of having one wholesome thought after another, you are, by all definitions of enlightenment except the magical ones, all definitions of enlightenment except the magical ones, you're enlightened right there. Why? Because you're lightened up. You have dropped all of the unwholesome baggage. And your mind is sharp and focused on having one wholesome thought after another after another. And you can see that those thoughts are wholesome always because you're in the here now. You're not comparing what you see with something old. You're not trying to understand a sunset. A sunset is to be seen as a sunset, not to become an engineer or a scientist talking about what happens on the inside of the sun. That is all conceptualized thinking, but just absorbed into or actually in sensory input of watching that sunset or watching a boat go down the stream or watching an avalanche. Normally, it's something big and spectacular that will get our attention and we'll become focused on it. But the question is, can we learn to control that state so that we can be in it by a choice? Can we be in that state by choice? Because that's the way that we're practicing to get to the where all of the thoughts are in the same way as those cows are not doing anything other than sitting and grazing. Yes, Amit, you got a question?
Yes. So what I understood so far is, so first we keep the mind one wholesome thought after another. So mind is in control, and then this will lead to like the first jhana. And then when the mind is in control, then we can still the mind. And when the mind is still, when the
Mm-hmm.
mind is stopped, right, then this leads to the higher jhana,
Mm-hmm. All
right?
right. Yes. Let me introduce a new concept to you, and that is the distinction between the path and the fruit.
Mm.
All right. The path of first jhana is to continue to come back to the wholesome, to come back to the wholesome, and to come back to the wholesome. That's the path of first jhana. The fruit of first jhana is you've got one wholesome thought after another after another. And like I said, that's going to be 90% of your practice is the path to getting into the first jhana. And then the fruit of the first jhana is you've got it. You know you've got it. And that's when that wow state comes in. Wow, I can do this. But we're not going to be able to do it unless we practice and practice and practice. Taking it out of unwholesome states and putting it back into wholesome. To take it out of ordinary mind states and putting it into a wow state. To come out of our dissatisfactions into being satisfied. Going back to the original teaching of the Buddha, he talks about it in the sense of dukkha, dukkha nirodha. And where we mean dukkha here is being dissatisfied. And the dukkha nirodha is the state of being satisfied. All of our dissatisfactions are ended. And so we have not just random thoughts, wholesome or otherwise, but we have directed thoughts. And we're directing them to one of the four foundations of mindfulness, satipatthana. So you can direct your mind to focusing on the body. You can direct the mind to focus on your feelings. You can direct the mind to how the mind actually functions. And this is beginning to be the introduction to the higher jhanas. Or you can focus the mind on what kind of activities the mind is doing. And now there's a difference between the mind states and the mind's activities. It's so much so that it's actually the foundations of mindfulness are breaking these things down from the body, the feelings, the mind itself, and what states it is in, and the mind's objects. And in this case that we've been talking about so much, getting into that wow state, is because the mind's object, that sunset, we become to get absorbed in it. And the question is, what kind of mind state does that create? And the answer that we're looking for here is that mind state of wow. And that mind state of wow is also that word that we heard often in piti, in the Pali, is piti, and almost no one gets it right. It's a wow state. And it has also the quality of, I know that I can do this. Wow, I've got it made. Except that it's not a thought or a process or a concept, I've got it made. It's just the wow. That concept of, I've got it made, or wow, this is it. That word, this is it, is a concept that happens after the wow state. The question is, can you go right back into that wow state? This is actually now the fruit of the first jhana, where we have that combination of both piti and sukha. That the sukha, or the pleasure, is actually being out of the dukkha, because we're in a state of satisfaction. And that's the path. The fruit of being on that path of that satisfaction then is the success. And that success is that wow state. Now, so far, we have been talking about the first jhana. Before we go into those, let's see if anybody has any more questions about this. That this is something that we practice getting into. We practice getting into wholesome thoughts until we know we can do it. And that knowledge winds up being a wow state that is a state of mind.
No questions, but just an observation, which
Yes.
I spent, it was like about the past month or so, maybe not the last week, but before that, I'd gotten off, fallen off the practice wagon, and then I got back on it, and then I got back on it for like a solid month, and I was building some momentum, and it was, going well.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that I practiced best, like in that entire month. I don't think I ever thought about jhana once.
You don't have to think about jhana ever. Think about being in a state of wow. That in fact, that's a big problem with Western Buddhism, is these words about jhana. That in the time of the Buddha, everybody kind of knew what they were. They grew up with these phrases and these mind states and all. But now, I think because of Christianity and our looking through the lenses of religion, we could actually use the state of being in the presence of God. Now, the being in the presence of God is actually a conceptualized way of talking about it. That we could go into that wow state with the sunset. But Christians, when they're praying or when they stop praying after they've been praying or other things like that, and they'll go into that wow state, and then they call that, conceptualizing that wow state, as being in the presence of God. How good can it possibly be? This is it. This is the fruit of the first jhana. And so you don't have to think about that, but the Christians would think about it or talk about it in the states of being in the presence of God. Guess what? You're always in the presence of God. You cannot be out of the presence of God if you define God correctly, not as a deity or a personification of things, but actually in the environment in which you live. The paradise itself. In the Greek, they call it Basilica Theos. When Jesus talks about the kingdom of God is within you, the Greek words that are used is Basilica Theos. You've heard of a basilica before. That's like a huge cathedral or a palace or a garden like paradise. Okay? So being in paradise is the state of wow. And everybody has been in that state a number of times, but they had no control over it. They fell into it and they fell out of it. Just like that woman who got her cell phone to take a picture of the sunset had fallen out of it into concepts. Oh, I've got to keep this. And then the joke is she shows that photo to somebody else, and when she sees the photo, she goes back into that wow state just a little bit, but who she shows the photo to does not get into a wow state, because the wow state that she's in is out of the remembrance of being in the wow state. That you can actually get into these wow states and then say, put a bookmark on it or put a pin on it saying, this is it. I'm going to come back and control this and be into it. Just like flying through the air off of that motorcycle. I remembered that and say, yes, I understand that wow state. How can I put myself back into that without having to crash the motorcycle? So, Drew, you say that you're now understanding this wow state, but we don't have to use the word jhana for it. that jhana is just a concept that they had back in the time of the Buddha. But you do understand what I mean by wow state. Go ahead.
A little taste of it. It's just being relaxed and having goosebumps all over your body. Like I'm not saying like
Yes.
I was in jhana, but like I was closer. You know, I was getting into quote unquote retreat territory, which I guess is a good sign. Like the last time I felt like this was on retreat, and now I can do it off retreat, which is
Yes.
progress. But it's not hard won, but it takes a lot of practice.
It takes practice. It takes
It takes a
practice.
lot
Oh,
of practice.
mhm.
And like and it's weird. And some part of my mind is annoyed about this, but there's another part of my mind which is so used to the relaxing. I'm like, doesn't matter. Like it just so it's kind of weird because I only used to have the part of my mind which was just like, oh, it's taking so much practice, etc., etc. But now this other part of my mind which is new, which is like, well, this is the thing that stops, and this is the thing that's actually gone when you're practicing well. So
Mhm.
I I'm still practicing. I just practicing without all the I don't know, on a good day I'm practicing without all the stuff. And I'm trying to figure out how can I learn more about this, stay with the Sangha without getting caught up into, oh, he's in first jhana and she's so doing well with the nimitta and because that's not helpful. That's distracting to me, but
That's being
being a part of a Sangha
conceptualizing
is
again.
useful.
Mhm.
What?
Yes, that's conceptualizing.
Yeah,
Actually comparing ourselves to other people
not a
rather
fun
than
thing.
just merely being in the state of, wow, this is so nice.
Yeah, that's what I was saying when I was like practicing for that kind of month just by myself. I was like, well, getting back on track doesn't matter. I'll figure it out. I'll just do it. I'll build back up 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45, an hour. I can do this. I've done this before. And it
Actually,
was just simpler that way.
mhm. That's a very interesting thing about what you say of figuring it out. That's the kind of language that we use. The answer to that is you've already figured it out. The question is, can you live it? Can you be in that state? Figuring it out,
So,
by the way, is not in that state. It's figuring
yeah.
it out. It's mulling it over. It's thinking about it. But oftentimes, that will be the key in the sense of, I figured it out. Oh, wow, now I understand. We can actually create our own mental conditioning because we know that we know something.
All right.
How?
So here's what I do day to day. And it looks like the biggest thing that stops me from getting more relaxed and happier and kind of more calm and all that sort of fun stuff is the fact that I'm just accumulating garbage throughout the day. Most of it from just having to live a lay life, I think, but a good
Mhm.
chunk of it is just that's on me, fair enough. So what I do is I'll try and, on a routine, etc. I'll get up in the morning, I'll meditate, I'll continue with my day, and then occasionally throughout the day, I'll like remember, oh, should oh, there's gunk in my mind. Let me get out of this and just relax and just get
Mhm.
into that state and try and continue in that state. And then in the evening, I'll like go back over my day and I'll just have like a little book and a pen and paper. I'm like, okay, when I woke up, did I immediately remember that I've woken up? Did I think about the last thing that I remember, which was falling asleep? When I went to the toilet, when I went to the shower, did I remember? When I was cycling to work, did I remember? Was I
Mhm.
enjoying it? And so on and so forth. And most of the time the answer is no, but sometimes the answer is, oh yeah, that one thing I did remember, one thing. And it's doing that again and again and again. And I just noticed that, okay, I'm like, okay, next time I'm cycling to work, I'll make sure I'll like count my breath or just do something so I'm not thinking about, oh, that car's going to hit me, or oh, I'm so stressed when I go to work, etc. Or next time I'm cooking, I'm like, oh yeah, no, like take it one vegetable at a time, right? Like I'm trying to figure out, not figure, yeah, no, in this case it's figuring out, but in like a kind of, not like a, oh, it's a problem to be solved. It's like, no, how can I keep my mind more wholesome? Okay, if I take cooking one vegetable at a time, if I take uh showering one limb at a time. If I take brushing my teeth, kind of one set of rows at a time, then I'm breaking it up and I'm like, well, I can stay with one limb, and then if I just do another limb and then I stay with that, that's slightly easier.
Mm-hmm. You
But
mentioned something a while ago,
yeah,
and that was goosebumps.
yeah, and I
Does
could do that.
everybody know what he meant when he said goosebumps?
Give me 2 breaths and I'll get goosebumps.
All right. We should talk about goosebumps for just a moment. In the Hindi group within Hinduism, they talk about that with the word kriya. Perhaps you've heard that word before, kriyas. In the Visuddhimagga, they actually talk about this and refer it to piti, but it's not exactly piti, but these things are associated with piti, having goosebumps. Another one would be the kriya of uh, feeling like that you're just shivering all over. You get a tingling sensation. This is also referred to as kundalini rising. They use it as the example of a snake that's standing up. Okay? Uh, um, these things can be so, in fact, overwhelming that monks tend to jump up into the air. That, in fact, I forgot which group it was, but there was one Hindu group that tried to practice actually doing this rather than getting into a state where they could do it. And that was jumping around. They would be sitting in meditation and then try to jump into the air. All right. Um, these things also can get so strong that you would actually fall over. That the legs will move. They'll jump. Um, these sensations will get very strong. Okay. This in Buddhism is referred to with piti, but it's not actually piti, it's a bodily function or a bodily sensation that's associated with how good we feel.
Is it like twitching?
Twitching
Because I get those. Not
all over the
always.
body, twitching all over.
So I've had the goosebumps all over, and the twitching is like the occasional arm and leg. Usually it's like I'm like paying, for some reason, I'm paying slightly more attention to my arm or my leg, and then it twitches.
All right. Now, these kriyas, these kundalinis, and this piti actually has qualities of both the first and the second jhana. That in fact, you could say that it's the fruit of the first jhana, and that it begins to become the path of the second jhana, so that we take our focus off of our thoughts, one wholesome thought after another, and begin to put some gaps in there. And the reason that we do is because we're paying attention to how good we feel. We're really getting into that wow state, but this is not a sunset. This is not a car accident. This is not a looking over a cliff or at a canyon. This is something that we can do within our own mind, and it brings up these sensations, and we look at these sensations. We're watching these sensations, and we look and feel how good we feel. This then would be the path of the second jhana. And the funny thing about it is that when people normally go into this for the first few times, they don't stay very long. They jump right back out of it because they have a thought like, wow, this is nice. Or wow, I can stop my mind. Okay? Can you stop the mind and then leave it stopped? Well, if you're not very good at the first jhana, being able to control what the mind is doing, then if you go into this state to where the mind has stopped, the first thing that's going to happen when you recognize that state is leave it. maybe with a wow sensation. If you're lucky, if you're very lucky, if you're very not just lucky, but well practiced, then you will go out of that first jhana or second jhana, the path of the second jhana, back into the first jhana. But generally, that's a skill that people don't have. And what it'll do is they'll go back into the hindrances, they'll go back into an ordinary state. And that state is the desire of wanting to recapture it. And because they're trying to recapture something, they can't get it. That we need to be able to control that first jhana with one wholesome thought after another, so that if we can get into this second jhana, we can call it a flow state. We can talk about it in the sense of goosebumps and kriyas and all kinds of things, to where we got into that state because we were paying attention to the body. We were paying attention to the feelings. But what happens almost every time for the beginner is that they'll start conceptualizing that again. And they'll fall out of the jhana altogether. So, getting into the second jhana then requires a whole lot of control to get into it and to be able to maintain it. And the way of maintaining the second jhana is by being highly skilled in the first jhana. Like I said, that getting into the first jhana is 90%. Getting the fruit of the first jhana is another 5%. The rest of the path is quite easy. That in fact, we often will go, when we're very good at the first jhana, we'll go in and out of these higher jhanas automatically. And so the way to look at this is that the first jhana is the most important. That is the enlightenment. And the rest of it is kind of unnecessary, except for a couple of points. And that is that we can understand it intellectually without having the experience of understanding that when perception stops, feelings stop. When we can bring perception to a halt, all of the rest of the stuff. It's almost like imagining that you're sitting in a movie and you see something spectacular in the movie, and then we like it very much. We get absorbed into the movie, but we're still full of perception. We're still watching and thinking what's going to happen next, etc., like that. And so the fourth jhana would be when we're so absorbed, let us say, with that sunset, or so absorbed with the way that we feel, or so absorbed with whatever sensory input, that we come to the point of not perceiving things anymore. We're just totally into taking in data. Now, we normally would do this with the eyes closed, or not paying much attention to what the eyes are seeing, because really we're spending all of our time in the body, experiencing the body in this wow state, experience the feelings in this wow state. But that experiencing now is the perception. We're perceiving these states. That when we get really to the point of having much of an end to perception, then nothing is much happening at all. It gets really, really empty. In fact, I don't even know why the Westerners lust and thirst after the fourth jhana, because there's nothing there. There's nothing to it. That in fact, in the description of the fourth jhana, one of the words to describe it is nothing. Nothingness. It's empty. It's completely empty, because we've stopped perceiving, and because we're not perceiving, we're not even perceiving the input that we do have. That when we are looking and we know that we're looking, this would be the state that's called neither perception nor non-perception. Have you heard these terms before, like the state of nothing, the state of neither perception nor non-perception? And nobody knows what they mean. And so we start having magical ideas about what they mean. All right. Another one is, and in fact, I have to fuss at all the translators for using the word infinite, because the word infinite completely misses the point. In fact, there is no such thing as infinity as a mathematical construction. Everything is finite. It's just we can't count it. It's beyond counting, or it's beyond dealing with. That in fact, what we mean by infinite consciousness is not infinite at all. What it basically is, it seems like it's overwhelming, because if we are in a state where there is very little perception and only input, there is so much happening, overwhelming the amount of data that's coming in. But most of the data that's brought in is through the body. And yet, when we're little kids, we kind of learn to not pay attention to the body because the body is full of pain. The kid falls down. The kid hurts himself. And we don't like that. And so we stop listening to the body. But in these higher states, hello, Pedro, glad you're joining us.
Hello. Thank you.
When you're going into these states, this, let us say, going from the state of neither perception nor non-perception, where the input gets great, that means that we can really feel the body. This is what they mean by infinite space, is that you merge with space. There is no end to the body becomes part of the environment, or the environment and the body are one. This is an example of that, is when we did talk about it in the sense of breathing in God, breathing out God, breathing, and it's the body will tingle. It tingles with complete touch. For instance, there are neurons all over the body, and we're not paying attention to them at all. This is one of the reasons why mudras. Have you ever heard of the word mudra? The word mu is for the hand. So the mudras are hand postures or hand positions. There's a lot of them in Buddhism. This is one of them, except that this, what I'm doing, is wrong for the mudra. The mudra is not touching the fingers. Let me see if I can get up close to the camera. You see, how close can you get without actually touching? There's another mudra called touch the earth. And this is the mudra that will often be used in these higher jhanas, when one of the sensations that you'll have will be like you're enormously large, 60 feet, 80 feet in the air. You feel like you're flying. And yet all the Buddha will do is take his right hand that's sitting on his knee and touch the earth, to get the sensation back into the hand. We don't have to open our eyes. That's a lot of work. What we'll do instead is touch the earth to ground ourselves, to realize we are not 60 feet in the air. We are not flying. Those are bodily sensations that come under that guise of infinite space, except that it's not infinite. It's just a feeling of being very large. Have you ever had that feeling? Many people in meditation will say, yes, I've had that feeling of being enormous, 60 feet, 80 feet big. I've had the feeling of flying through the air. Have you ever had that experience? All right. Well, practice first jhana, and it will become available to you. But there's nothing to it. There's no reason to have this as a goal. This is something that we have to understand, that first jhana is the goal. Second jhana, not so much. Third jhana, a little bit. The fourth jhana, not the goal. That in fact, if you were trying to drive your car and being in these higher jhanas, you'd get arrested. Like DUJ, driving while under the influence of jhana, because you're dangerous. Unless you're flying so well that you can fly with the car and take that up off the ground too. But that's not likely to happen, not while driving. So, let's go through some of the analogies that the Buddha gives for these jhanas. The first jhana has the analogy of touching, they use in the suttas the analogy of soap. And the soap is a powder. How would you make the soap, a powder, into a bar of soap or into a keg? Because the powder blows all over the place. The analogy that I use instead, because my grandmother, when I was little, she made biscuits every day. And she made biscuits exactly the way that the Buddha talks about the bathman doing powder. And that is that you spread the powder, or in her case, the flour, out over the table, and then dips her hands in the water and sprinkles the powder. This is the way that we do first jhana. What are the sprinkles that we're doing? We're sprinkling our mind with wholesome thoughts. And as we continue to sprinkle this powder with joy, it begins to no longer be a powder that blows all over the place like the mind, it just goes anywhere, free association. But we can get it unification so that there is no dry spots, that we knead the dough. Or like the pizza man, he throws that dough into the air, right, with great control. And there is no more powder left. It's all just dough. In other words, the powder that used to be able to scatter around in the wind is now unified. It's stuck together. So this is the analogy then for the first jhana, is being able to get the mind into a state of dough. It's not dripping wet. The wetness comes later. In the beginning, we just want it to be real dough. The second jhana then is referred to as being caught in a creek or a rushing water. The example that they use is an artesian well. Do you know what I mean by an artesian spring, a spring of water? It almost always happens at the bottom of a mountain or a bottom of a hill where water seems to just gush right out of the ground. All right? When we understand that that can happen, what they did in the old days, and in fact, this happened to me when I was 12, 13 years old. We lived in a town, and the guy who was our landlord had built a dam around an artesian well so that it become a pond. And we loved that pond, even though that the pond was pretty big, because there was a pier or a dock. Everybody, when they were swimming, would do around the dock. But out in the middle of this pond, there was this place where that artesian well was coming up, and that we would dive down to that place. And it was really magnificent because the water that was coming out of the well was very cold as compared to the surface water of the pond itself. And so it would bubble, but it wasn't air bubbles. It was bubbling in the sense of all of this cold water was rushing and merging with all of the warm water, and it was moving a lot. And those kids would get down in there to enjoy that because, it was just so marvelous. It was really, really magnificent to feel that rushing of the water. This is the analogy of the second jhana, is being in that artesian well. I don't know if any of you have ever had that experience. I was kind of lucky. You probably don't even know what an artesian well is, or a spring, where the water just springs right out of the ground, sometimes quite gushing. And when you dam it up into a pond, it gives a situation. Well, the Buddha did. he had this, and so this is the analogy that he has for that second jhana, because it's quite a rush. It's quite a rush. It's sensational. The body is turning and boiling and bubbling and mixing around. It's almost out of control. This is the analogy back to the words that we were talking about of the kriyas, or the kundalini, or the goosebumps, or the energy that comes up your back. Cold chills is another one. When we have that sensation of cold. But in fact, the monks in Tibet are really, really lucky. They actually practice this. How do they practice that? They do it by taking their robe and putting it into a spring. This actually is done in a ceremony. They'll take it and put it into a spring and get it really, really cold, and then they'll take that robe and wrap it around themselves and start to generate steam. They have the thought of hot. They have the thought of warm. They have the thought of, this is not cold, I can handle it. And with that thought, they go into these states of dealing with the cold. So that coldness is also part of the kriyas that we're talking about. Shivering with cold, except that they practice it that way to get used to it. But the real practice is being able to shiver because you remember it. And when you talk about it, you start shivering again. I can bring it up when I'm talking about it. It just feels so nice. All right. This is that quality of the second jhana. And the fruit of the second jhana is when we begin to control it, going into the path of the third jhana. And the analogy that's used there is a brook or a stream that's got mud on the bottom, and the lotus flower is growing up and being on the surface and opening its leaves. And even though it's been gushing and rushing with water while it's under the water, when it brings the lotus flower and opens up, guess what? It's dry on the inside. It's dry. This is an important point, that you can, by going into, or let us say, using the term of going into the third jhana, what we're actually doing is getting over how good it feels being in that artesian well, being gushing with feelings. Everything feels so wonderful and so nice, but the third jhana is basically the point of, yeah, but so what? I can control this. There's nothing much to it. I can do this. And so that's the analogy of the third jhana. And the analogy of the fourth jhana, which really has a whole lot to do with that statement about infinite space, is imagine that you are having a white sheet, a huge white sheet that completely covers the body so that it's shimmering white. And that you become that sheet so that there is no distinction between you being under the sheet and the sheet itself. That you mix yourself into the universe itself. You become at one with the universe, at one-ment, wholeness. You become merged into it, that who you are is no longer there. Or what you are is no longer there. You're not there anymore. All that is there is the experience of having no boundaries. This is the point back that I was talking about before about flying through the air. You have a feeling of weightless. You have a feeling of growing immensely to be very, very big. This is also what you would call the beginning of, or the path to the fourth jhana. And so this feeling of being at one with everything, taking in all of the data, that's what we would mean by infinite consciousness. But it's not infinite, it's just overwhelming. There's just so much happening And it doesn't have a particular direction because, like that shimmering sheet that's over us, there, there's no you there. There's just the experience itself without having an experiencer. Does this kind of make sense to you? There's no one there experiencing this. It's just the experience itself.
Yeah, this happened to me with the tea. I got a big bit beginner's luck, but
Uh-huh.
it definitely changed my perspective on things quite a bit. I was like, oh my God, what just happened?
Yes, what has happened here? And this is where the perception comes in. This is the important part of perception, is that we are no longer perceiving it because we become it. We're no longer trying to understand it or telling ourselves stories about it. We're not having any thoughts. We're just having an experience that is so strong that there's no experiencer anymore. There's just experience. And so we can take that analogy of that shimmering sheet, that everything begins to shimmer. Everything turns kind of white. Everything goes kind of to nothing at all. There's no me there anymore. And so these words that are used to talk about the fourth jhana, infinite space, infinite consciousness, neither perception nor non-perception, nothingness, those states are actually the descriptions of what it's like to be in the fourth jhana. But when dudes read that stuff in the books, they start adding 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 things to it. They start adding it up as if this was space beyond the fourth jhana, rather than this is the experience of what happens in that fourth jhana. So let's take a moment and ask, does anybody have any questions about this?
I think also when people take psychedelics like magic mushroom or LSD, I think they are going into the similar state, right? And
Precisely.
what I
Except
read
that you're
is
not controlling it. It's again, that would be like the boxer going into a flow state and wins the boxing match. Okay, so these psychedelics don't guarantee those states. It's almost like a shock. That in fact somebody can take LSD time after time after time after time, and the more he takes it, the less effect it has on him. To where if we're practicing this naturally, the more you do it, the better at it you get.
yes,
But
I think
yes,
with
you're
practice
right.
you also control better. So with the LSD, there is no guarantee if it will feel good or it could be a bad trip.
All right. So
But
once,
one thing, just one thing is what I'm kind of reading, what neuroscientists are saying, that we have a particular network in our brain, default mode network, and which is generating a lot of these thoughts about I, me, and time and space. And what meditation is doing for people who are quite experienced, and also LSD or psychedelics, so they are silencing this particular network. And when this network is silent, then they go into this flow state or this fourth channel. So this is so far, I think, what the science is saying about it.
all right. So we can talk about it like this, in the sense of the ordinary mind filled with hindrances, filled with random thoughts, is agitated itself. We actually get that feeling of agitation in the body that can be described or talked about in the sense of anxiety or panic at a high level. And the first jhana then is much, much, much more calm than that, because we're having one wholesome thought after another, and the mind now is capable of being in the present moment and seeing very well. But that's still quite a lot of agitation. The second jhana, then, when the piti gets very strong, when those kriyas, when that gushing sensations and all of that start to arise, that's actually the result of the mind quietening down even more so that we can begin to actually experience the activities that are happening in the mind. So the second jhana is actually more calm than the first, but that's when we experience all of these kriyas and things like this. So we can say then that the third jhana is even more peaceful than the second jhana, because we get over all of those high points, all of those kriyas, all of those sensations, etc., like that, begin to melt away. And now we're getting really, really, really calm. And then going into the fourth jhana is even more calm than that. Okay, so this is a calming process. From high agitation to the first jhana to the second jhana. Then in fact, Bhikkhu Buddhadasa talks about this, that second jhana, if you stay in the second jhana a long, long time, you begin not to like it. It's too much. The analogy that we would use would be like going to Mount Everest. You know that there's a kind of competition that only a few hundred people have ever made it to the peak of Mount Everest. And they have to plan very carefully to get there. They have what you would call a base station. And they get way, way up there in that base station. They've got all of their goods. They've got a stove, and they're getting acclimated to the lack of air. And then after they're there on that base station for a couple of weeks or whatever, then they'll go actually to the top of the mountain. How long do they stay at the top of the mountain? How long do they actually stay right on the peak, right at the pinnacle? How long do they stay there? Here's
couple minutes.
Minutes. It's actually kind of dangerous to stay longer.
Yes, because it's cold, because in fact, you would freeze to death if you stayed up there a long time. You need to get back down to that base station. So you can think of the second jhana that way, is that you don't want to stay in those really, really high peaks way up there on the mountain. You want to get back to the base station. But then the base station then is going to be like the third jhana, to where now, even though you're out in the cold, you feel warm and toasty in that base station camp. That's only a few hundred meters below the pinnacle, but you can't stay at the top. And Bhikkhu Buddhadasa talks about that those really, really high places that we go to, we can't sustain that. We don't even want to. At this level, that's way too much work, even though it's not nearly as much work as hindrances. But that second jhana is perceived to be intense, extremely intense. And so we want to rise above that like the lotus. We want to come out of that, not go back into the mud, but to come and rise above it as the lotus, to where we're free from that. And that will then set the stage for us going into this shimmering kind of state. Now remember again, everybody has these experiences from time to time because of the event or the circumstances. And what we're talking about here is learning how to do it, how to control it, how to get there intentionally. This gives you the experience of, wow, I can do it. I have made it. It gives an intense sense of success. And we want to rise above that intense sense of success, like the child who puts a toy together. And when they finally get it together, they come running to daddy and say, "Daddy, daddy, daddy, look at this, I get this." Daddy doesn't have that intense sense. He knows it's together. He congratulates the child for being able to do it, but he doesn't have that intense sensation or feelings that the child has. Okay, he's beyond that now. He's above it. And this would be then the third jhana is coming out of that flow, that brook, that heavy-duty waves that we're in, like an ocean, just up and down like this, like in a storm. This is the second jhana, and we would rather have it placid, a placid sea. And so that placid sea is the third jhana. So the fourth jhana then is that state of the shimmering, because we're in tune with the vibrations of reality. And we think about it going under that sheet so that the boundaries that we have are broken down. We're at one-ment, we're at atonement. And this is where perception now is beginning to melt away. And we have just mere sensations, mere sensory awareness, except that when the perception goes completely away, then we have no way of actually gaining that that consciousness anymore, because we can't perceive the consciousness. This is when it goes into a state of nothing at all. It's almost like being asleep. It's almost like being very, very so passive, so still, that we don't want to come out of these states at all. That we like it, but there's nothing to it. There's nothing there really. And so these are the fourth jhana and all of the states that it has, and that one of the pieces of information that we can pick up is that there is nothing to it, and that this is the actual end. There's no more place to go. When we stop perceiving, there's no feelings left, there's no thoughts left, there is no sensory input left, there is just nothing much at all. And the story is in Sutta number 111, one by one as they occur. This is the story of Sariputta going through these states. Now, I would assume that he was already quite skilled in meditation, especially quite skilled in the first jhana, so that it only took him about 2 weeks to go through all of these states to where he could come to the point of seeing directly, not because somebody on the internet told you or that you conceptualize it or understand it, but whether the direct experience of nothing. The direct experience of nothing, which means no feelings, no body, no thought, no states of mind. It's very, very similar to sleep itself, except that when we're asleep, we tend to dream. We dream in images. That in fact, I've caught myself dreaming in code, most specifically PHP. But this state is a little higher than that in the sense that we're dreaming, but we're dreaming nothingness. Dreaming nothing at all. And again, people don't stay in these states for very long. That if Sariputta had gotten into that fourth jhana and not come back out of it and come back into the first jhana, he would have never been able to teach. And he was the Buddha's main teacher. And so, though those things are in the suttas, they're there, they exist. People can practice and get into these states, but you don't need it. You can stay with the intellectualization of that really there is nothing there. But I don't have to practice it. I don't have to know it. What we really need to know is the secret to the practice is the first jhana. That the Buddha made a major mistake in his life because he had teachers. One of the teachers was Ala Kalama. that in fact there's a Kalama Sutta, and I assume that Ala Kalama was part of the Kasala family, the Kalama family. And that's why they were asking him the kind of questions that they were, was because this dude could go into these really high states as if they were important or something. And so the Buddha says, oh, yeah, that stuff's got to be important. Oh, I've got to go practice that. And when he got what Ala Kalama had to teach, they says, okay, well, you become the teacher, because Ala Kalama doesn't do it as good as you do. And he says, no, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something better. And so then he went to a teacher by the name of Ramaramaputta. And Ramaramaputta had already died, but his son knew all the details about what he was talking about. He couldn't do it himself, but he was talking about it. And so the Buddha went into these fourth jhana states. And then he came back out and they says, oh, well, we want you to be our teacher too. And he says, nope, I don't want to do that. I'm looking for something else. And that's when he went to practice the austerities with Naganataputta, the 424, whatever, of the Tatankaras that they talk about, Mahavira. And he did everything that Mahavira was talking about. And here he almost killed himself. He starved himself. He flagellated himself. He did all kinds of things. And then he got caught in a stream and he couldn't get back out. And that was when he recognized that, hey, if I can't even stand up and walk out of this creek, how am I possibly going to be able to become enlightened? And so that's when he started to eat and regain some of his strength. And that's when he realized, this is back to that Sutra number 36, when he realized finally that it's the first jhana, that which he could do a little bit when he was a teenager. So he had already had a lot of skills in the jhanas, and he went as far as you could go. And then later he talks about Sariputta going as far as you could go. But then he comes back to say, but that's too far. That the real place, the real landing place, the sweet spot, is the first jhana.
This is the one by one as they occurred sutta, or is this a different one?
This is 36, but 36 and 111 are very, very similar. One was when the Buddha was doing it, and the other one was with the Sariputta doing it. So when his companions saw that he had started getting fat again, getting a little belly on him because he was eating some rice milk, they abandoned him, thinking that he had fallen away from the path. So when he did go to Bodh Gaya and sit there for about 6 weeks, so they say, is when he began to figure out how the mind works. Because he could be in that state of fourth jhana, he could watch how perception creates imagery and creates conceptualizations that then contact us, giving us feelings. And so he actually got to the point of understanding the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path through the Second Noble Truth. And the depths of the Second Noble Truth is called Paticca Samuppada, which is exactly how the mind works. So he could see that. You can too if you pay attention, but you don't have to pay attention by going into the fourth jhana. You can pay attention and see that directly from the first jhana. This is actually what they're talking about when they say the Vipassana jhanas. They have insight into these jhanas without actually having to gain the skills of going there. In other words, you can get really cold and you can see pictures of the Mount Everest and you can see how tough it is. You don't have to climb Mount Everest yourself to get a load of Mount Everest. So, after that, he went back to his friends and they didn't want to have much of anything to do with him, but he did talk to them. And what he said to them is known as the Dhammachakravartanta Sutta. It's in the Samyutta Nikaya. And what he said, the first thing that he said he had 2 points that he took in that first jhana. The second was the first sutta. The second time that he talked, it was the fire sutta. And that's when everybody got it, but that's because they were in there. But I want to make the point that the very first thing the Buddha taught was the middle path. And that's what I'm trying to point out to you, that we do not need to go to the pinnacles. We do not need to go to the high places. What we need to do is find where is the middle path. And I point out to you that that middle path is the first jhana. Why? Because the extremes are the flagellation, the hindrances, the problems of life, the tough dookie, everything like that. And the other part, over the extremes, are the second, third, and fourth jhana states. And at the middle path, the base point, the sweet point, the Goldilocks place, is this first jhana. And this is why we want to not just see that, not only is it 90% of the effort that we put into, it might as well be all of the effort that we put into. If you can get into and maintain and control the first jhana, these other jhana states will happen from time to time. You can play with them. They're toys to play with. But what you want to do is maintain this first jhana state, this flow state, this state of being able to control your mind no matter who criticizes you, or if you stump your toe, or if you have a wreck in your car, or whatever it is. In fact, if you're in first jhana, you're probably not going to have an accident because you're going to be mindful. You're watching what you're doing. You're watching where you're going. And so the likelihood of you having an accident is very, very low. But what will happen is somebody will criticize us, and we don't like that. We'll go into that state of bad feelings. We're back into the hindrances again. So can you actually practice to the point of being able to maintain that first jhana? This is the point that I make is clean the mind, and then clean the mind, and then clean the mind, and then clean the mind, which gives the reference to the shampoo bottle, that the entire teachings of the Buddha is on the back of almost every commercial shampoo bottle that you buy at the grocery store or 7-Eleven or whatever. It has the phrase on the back of it, rinse and repeat, right? That's on every shampoo bottle, rinse and repeat. Well, that's the teaching. That's it. Dukkha, dukkha nirodha. Rinse all of that dukkha out, then rinse it out again, and then rinse it out again, and then get rid of it again, over and over and over again until we get really, really good at it. Not only really good at it, but we can maintain it. That this is what life, it makes it life sweet, is when everything is really good. So, please, anybody got anything to say? Any questions, any points about this? That it's the middle path that we're looking for. Go ahead.
Yeah, so talking about the first jhana, right? There is kind of different types of thought. There is the discursive thought, then there is, imagery, which comes like really quickly. All the other
observational
types.
Thought, exactly.
Yeah, and the discursive thought is kind of quite a bit of work. So would it also be kind of make sense in the first jhana to over time learn to have these subtler thoughts that maintain this state instead of having to put so much energy into thinking discursively?
Yes, thinking discursively takes a lot of work. And not thinking much at all is easy. So let's take it easy. Let's not do so much thinking and mulling over and trying to figure things out and trying to get it right. Let's just enjoy life. Because if you're in a state of enjoyment, that's the first jhana. This is good. This is sweet. This is nice. Hello, Catherine. Good to see you. You joined us after we'd finished this talk.
Are you finished to talk now? Oh,
Yes.
bad time.
Yeah.
We just
Yeah.
finished a group kind of we do like a group circle sharing with everyone, the monks and everyone in the temple goes to sharing with Ajahn Maitri. So we just finished that like this.
Well, today we have been rehashing what we talked about last week in the sense of perception. And what we want to do is learn to control the perception rather than eliminating it. Just like we want to learn to control the thoughts rather than eliminating them. That the sweet spot is the first jhana. Agnes, do you have any comments to make? I see you sitting there with a huge smile on your face.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, thank you so much.
How about you, Pedro? You got anything to say?
No, not really, but thank you. I followed everything, so it was really clear, really clear. I thank you so much.
Good. Amit, what about you?
Yes, I'm also very satisfied from my side. It's very clear, and I will try to whack the cows, keep them straight on the path.
Yes, keep those cows straight. Whack them cows. Take the effort to straighten them out. This is noble right effort, is to keep those cows in line.
Definitely.
All right, Marcus, how about you? Any last thoughts?
No, I'm good. It was a nice talk.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I've really had fun with this. We'll see you later.
See you. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Dhammarato,
Yes.
yeah, can I talk to you for a few minutes?
Yeah, let's finish this call and then we'll talk privately.
Okay, I'll call you then. Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.